I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, science reporter Emily Anthes breaks down the impact of research grant cuts at the NIH. And Emma Bubola from Italy takes us inside the secretive Bezos-Sanchez wedding in Venice. But first, I'm joined by Emma Fitzsimmons, City Hall Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Emma has been covering every turn in this extraordinary mayoral primary, where progressive Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani surged ahead of former Governor Andrew Cuomo in an 11-candidate field. This week, after ranked choice voting tabulation in the third round, Zoran Mamdani won the New York City Democratic mayoral primary, defeating Andrew Cuomo 56 to 44%. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. How big of a deal is Mamdani's victory? This was somewhat of a surprise victory, right?
Yeah, I think we were all stunned that it happened by such a large margin and that it happened on primary day. I think at the end people were calling it like a jump ball, a toss-up, but he won so decisively. And I think it's hugely exciting for the progressive movement in New York City and hugely embarrassing for Andrew Cuomo, who tried to make this political comeback and failed.
And you talked about his big margin of victory. Mamdani did better than Eric Adams did, right? What does that mean for the fact that he did so well in the primary?
Much better than Eric Adams. And Eric Adams called himself the face of the Democratic Party. Now Mamdani is saying, I have a mandate. And he's going to put pressure on people like Kathy Hochul to say, these people elected me. Now how are you going to help me deliver my agenda? How are you going to help me do universal childcare and free buses and all these programs that he ran on?
We had the pleasure of working on a story together with our colleagues, Nick Fandos and Ben Oreskes, about how Mamdani won. So tell me, how does someone who was pretty unknown 6 months ago now become the Democratic nominee for the largest city in the country?
Yeah, a lot of the focus has been on his charisma, on these online videos, but I think just as important is this canvassing army. I went out with his canvassers in East Village on a hot summer night, and they were going door to door, and they were so earnest and so enthusiastic, and they were just getting out his message. They spoke with a retired teacher when I was with them, and they said, put him somewhere on your ballot, leave Cuomo off your ballot. And they listed all of his policies, and she seemed open to the message. So this canvassing army, we talked to people who said it's much better to have volunteers than to have paid field staff because they really believe in the message. And he had 50,000 volunteers. They knocked on more than 1 million doors. You can't underestimate how big of a factor that was. The other big thing was the Brad Lander cross-endorsement. We've reported on that, how it sort of came together, and how Brad Lander, saw the writing on the wall that he wasn't going to win and wanted to help get Mamdani over the finish line. And it was a sophisticated ranked choice strategy, right? 4 years ago, there wasn't a big cross endorsement like this. And I think it really helped Mamdani.
What did Andrew Cuomo do wrong? Why did he lose the primary? Because for most of the race, he was in the lead, according to most polls.
His campaign is saying, look, we got about the same amount of votes as Eric Adams did 4 years ago. We just didn't anticipate the new voters, all these voters that don't come out regularly, the young voters. But I think, they're doing a lot of second guessing now. We wrote about the Rose Garden strategy, right? He didn't talk to us much. He didn't do the retail politics. He didn't talk to regular people. He sort of held us and everyone at a distance. There were questions about whether he really even lives here. And so I think he sort of came in with this air of inevitability and thought he could win like he had state campaigns. And he wasn't familiar with New York City politics and all of the intricacies. And I think he was a little arrogant about running his campaign. And now he's trying to decide if he's going to run again in November.
Yeah, tell me about that. He still has an independent ballot line. Cuomo could still be on the ballot in November, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure what he's going to do. At first, I didn't think he would run because it was such an embarrassing loss. But I think, people are in his ear talking about the polling, saying there's a path for you. There's some voters who don't want a socialist, and they don't want Eric Adams, and they don't want Curtis Sliwa. So I think he's deliberating right now. But today, Al Sharpton said Cuomo should not run in November. And the unions rallied with Mamdani. So if Cuomo doesn't have people like Al Sharpton, he doesn't have the unions on his side, then who are going to be his allies?
And he's not going to be the only one on the ballot. Will there also be Mayor Eric Adams is running as an independent, right? And then Curtis Sliwa was the Democratic nominee. And there's also Jim Walden, an attorney who's running as an independent. How do you see this November election shaking up? Does Mamdani have an advantage going into November?
I think he's the favorite. The Democrat in a general election is usually the favorite, and he had so much sort of momentum on primary night. A lot of people are really excited about his campaign. I talked to voters who voted for him who said, I'll be back in November. I'll be canvassing between now and then. And so I think, people will always say to me, though, you can't count Eric Adams out. He's a street fighter. He knows New York City. He's won before. So no one is going to underestimate him. And I think Mamdani is going to, fight for every last vote. But I think there is a concern among some of the power brokers in the city that Cuomo and Adams could sort of split the moderate vote. And so I think there'll be pressure for one of them not to run because, who will the business community, some of the big donors line up behind? The idea, if there's 5, reasonably successful candidates, you could split it, everyone getting 20%. And then some people are worried that means Curtis Sliwa could win with, the 30% he got 4 years ago.
Right. Tell me about that. How could Curtis Sliwa win the election potentially?
So 4 years ago, he got about 30% of the vote versus Eric Adams in the general election. And, I'm struck so many times by how popular he is among Republicans and in the outer boroughs. He wears the red beret. He's the founder of the Guardian Angels. He has 14 to 16 cats. I once visited his studio apartment in Manhattan and met all the cats. And so some people sort of disregard him, but a lot of voters really like Curtis Sliwa. He shows up after incidents happen. He shows up to protest new homeless shelters. He has a lot of goodwill among more conservative voters. But he even said, I'm not the Trump candidate. Eric Adams is the Trump candidate. And I think that's Eric Adams' biggest challenge as he runs for re-election. I think it's difficult to win right now in New York City if you're openly aligned with Donald Trump.
Right. But Mayor Adams has also had a difficult first term. He was the first sitting mayor to be indicted. Dozens of resignations, arrests, in his administration. Will voters consider him?
I think, I hear from people that Democrats don't love him, Republicans don't love him. There are some pockets of the city that are maybe still loyal to him, but besides the federal indictment, which was later dismissed, I think a lot of people are mad about the budget cuts. We covered those, the cuts to libraries and preschool. He's sort of corrected on that now and is funding those programs. But at the time, people were really mad when their library closed, and or they were mad that he didn't expand 3K. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why people have concerns about Eric Adams, but he has the bully pulpit as the sitting mayor. He was out today. Yesterday he had a press conference with Jessica Tisch, the police commissioner, who is pretty popular. And so I think he's going to be leaning on her, leaning on the public safety message. And, some people will say, without the federal indictment, without the Trump alliance, without some of these complicating factors, he's done some good things. Crime is down, jobs are up. He's done the trash containerization. There's certain things that he's done, City of Yes, the housing zoning proposal. But he's just had so many sort of distractions and setbacks that it's hard to see a path, to victory. But again, don't count him out.
Can't count him out.
Mm-hmm.
So Mr. Mamdani, let's talk a little bit about his policies. He had a very sort of clean campaign message, fast, free buses, freeze the rent. He was criticized for a lot of those promises. Can he get any of that done if he is elected mayor?
I think if you look at each proposal, there's different levels of difficulty. I think the rent freeze is pretty straightforward. He can nominate people to the Rent Guidelines Board and they can freeze the rent. Bill de Blasio did it. I think universal childcare is one of the more challenging ones. He's going to need a lot of funding, but de Blasio did, universal pre-K. The city-owned grocery stores has gotten a lot of attention. He's proposing one in each borough, and I think that that's an achievable goal. And he said himself, let's see if they work. If they don't, no biggie. If they do, then we could expand the program. And then fast and free buses, I think, is an interesting one. I think it could be achievable. There's been some pilot programs for a few bus routes. And I think if he goes to Albany in his first year, if he wins and says, to the governor, this is the one thing I want $400 million a year for buses. This is what the people want, and really drives home that message, it's within the realm of possibility within, budgets that are several $100 billion. And so I think there are different levels, but I think the other thing he'll, be looking for the most is just sort of can he run the city since he has limited experience? Does he hire the right people? One of his biggest proposals was this new agency to look at public safety and to handle mental health calls. And so can he get that up and running? He promised a lot, and then he's going to have to actually deliver on it.
Right, but he's also called for raising taxes on the wealthiest 1% to fund a lot of his proposals. That seems like a non-starter in Albany. Is he wedded to that idea in order to accomplish his goals?
I think he's more set on the goal itself, like the delivering the program. And like Bill de Blasio wanted to raise taxes on the wealthy, and when Cuomo said no to that, he found other funding for pre-K. So I think Hochul's been pretty clear that she doesn't want to raise taxes, although the assembly leader said he was open to it. And so I think he cares more about getting the funding somehow, even if it's not a tax increase.
And finally, there is one question about Mamdani's policies. He has said that he does not necessarily want to retain mayoral control of the schools, which is something Mike Bloomberg fought tooth and nails for. Eric Adams fought recently to get it renewed. Why doesn't he want to control the schools, and how might that affect his platform going forward?
That's something I want to hear more about. I feel like we actually wrote a story about how the schools were not one of the biggest issues in the race. I think there were so many other things going on with the Trump budget cuts and affordability and public safety. But de Blasio often said when he was mayor, the two things that you can hold me accountable for are the police and the schools. Those are the two things, the biggest parts of our budget, the things I have the most control over. And so we haven't heard that much from Mamdani about what he would do when it comes to public schools. He went to Bronx Science for high school, so he has the experience of being, a public school student here in New York City. But I'm really curious why he's not pushing for mayoral control, because that's been such like an important part of Eric Adams and Bill de Blasio and everyone. They would go to Albany and fight for that. So I'm really curious to see what ideas he has for the schools.
Right. We'll follow up your reporting, and I'm sure you'll be reporting on that. Thank you for joining us, Emma. Coming up next, the Trump administration sends shockwaves through the world of medical research. We'll get an update. Last week, responding to controversial NIH research grant cuts initiated by the Trump administration, a federal judge in Massachusetts ordered the NIH to halt the terminations and restore over 900 canceled grants. It came as a relief for many in the medical research community, but concerns remain about future funding stability. Times science reporter Emily Anthes joins us now to explain. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the real effect of this order to halt the cuts?
It's definitely a partial victory, and I think an important victory. Scientists were wondering all along if what the administration was doing was legal, and here's a judge saying it's not. But there are some important caveats and limitations there. The first is that it only applies to a specific subset of grants. Like thousands of grants have been cut, and here are a few hundred that have been ordered to be restored. The second is that the administration can still appeal, and the third is that frankly, we don't know if the administration is going to follow what the court orders. They haven't always been doing that, and so I think these scientists are relieved, but they're not counting on this money till they see it in their accounts.
Now, your reporting has showed that a lot of the grants were targeted for DEI, vaccine research. I'm wondering, is there any rhyme or reason to the administration's decision to cut these grants? How do they make these decisions of which grants get cut?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define rhyme or reason. You can see the administration's logic there. There were clearly topics that they did not want to fund research on. As you said, DEI-related things, things related to vaccines, vaccine hesitancy, health misinformation. And so it was very clear what those disfavored topics were. From that point, though, things get a little more complicated. I mean, we can't know exactly how the decisions were made, but we talked to NIH insiders who said it basically seemed like what someone was doing was hitting Control F and like looking through thousands of grants for the word diversity, for instance, or racism, and cutting those grants. And the reason they think that is because so many grants were caught up in this, and they weren't all necessarily really focused on whatever that keyword was.
And there were grants that used the word diversity in a scientific way, but
exactly, like genetic
canceled.
Diversity.
Right.
And again, the researchers often weren't given exact reasons why their money was canceled, so it's hard to say, but they said, the only thing I can think of is I say the word diversity 3 times in my abstract, but I'm talking about genetic diversity.
Even if a grant is studying, Black maternal health, for example, aren't there wider benefits for everyone, for all women?
Absolutely, and I guess there are 2 points here that are worth making. One is that, yes, there are wider benefits for all women, and not just for all women, but the men who are part of their lives, their children, their families. But also, even if that weren't the case, I mean, there's been a lot of research throughout history on white men, and part of what this research is meant to do is to close the gap in our knowledge on the health of everyone else in society. So even if this research were, quote unquote, only helping Black women, I think a lot of scientists and researchers are saying that is still important research to do.
Yeah, so even though they've targeted DEI, the Trump administration has shifted some of their priorities, it seems like, right? They are interested in whether vaccines cause autism, for example. Aren't those equally as quote unquote controversial as some of the other grants they're cutting?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see, and that's been one of our big questions. You know, they're cutting a lot of this grant money, and I think some of it won't be replaced. Like, some of what they want to do is just reduce spending. But they are also seeking new studies on their own priorities. As you mentioned, one of them is into a potential connection between childhood vaccines and autism. And that's a connection that has been debunked repeatedly over and over again, that scientists just dismiss at this point. But the administration wants to sort of reopen that question, and so it's going looking for research.
I wonder, the United States is one of the leading research centers in the world. I'm wondering if our scientists stop studying brain cancer, for example, what's going to be the long-term effect of those grant cuts?
You know, this is something that's really tricky to talk about, because the way that science works and basic science works is so much of the benefit comes not just years, but decades later, and is often unexpected. So yes, studying brain cancer might lead to better treatments for cancer and for particular groups of patients, but it might also lead to totally unrelated insights that we can't even see. So, you know, most narrowly, it potentially sets back the fight against various diseases, but it also could have a much broader effect of discouraging young people from going into science, of not leading to some of the economic and pharmaceutical developments that have been so important in this country. I mean, scientists are really worried about a cascade of ripple effects that could be quite long-lasting.
I'm wondering, how are young scientists who are, just coming into the field dealing with that reality? Also, how are universities and hospitals adjusting to this new reality?
Young scientists are really unsettled, and I think that's part of what's so difficult for them right now, is that things still feel very uncertain and unpredictable. And, what's happening now is damaging enough, even if it were to be reversed tomorrow. But I think not knowing how long this might last, is this the new normal, does funding come back, makes them uncertain about whether they want to stay in science at all, and certainly in the US. Hospitals and universities are, they're making contingency plans, but they're biding their time a little bit. Sort of as we started by talking about, some of these actions are still tied up in the courts. I think there's still some hope that maybe not all of these cuts will end up going through, but they're, planning for the worst, and they are thinking about, maybe we don't hire these extra positions that we were planning to hire. Some of them have frozen admissions of new graduate students because they can't count on having that money. And
the administration is proposing further cuts still, right, to the NIH, $18 billion, or nearly 40% of their budget. Would that just mean the end of the NIH?
I mean, it wouldn't quite mean the end of the NIH, but I think you could argue that it might mean the end of the NIH as we know it. Because the agency gives out these multi-year grants, it already has a lot of grants it's committed to. And so one expert I talked to said, like, a cut of that scale would basically mean the agency could issue no new grants, that the little money it had left, they would be spending that all to sort of maintain their current commitments. And I mean, that would be unthinkable for this premier biomedical agency to fund no new research at all. Is, a place I think a lot of people thought we'd never be.
Right. Is the damage that's being done irreparable? If a new administration comes in, 3 years from now, will they be able to correct some of what's been done?
I mean, I think that's hard to say, and probably depends on who you ask. Most people I talk to say that the damage, at the very least, will take a lot of time to repair. When you start messing with things like, the pipeline at the level of students, that's not something that can come back tomorrow. But for some scientists, it might be irreparable. If they close their labs, if they leave the field. I mean, there could be no coming back from that. So it sort of depends on the scale, but certainly the damage that's already been done, all the experts I talk to say it will take us at least quite a long time to come back from it.
And are other countries picking up the slack of the United States, or other countries gaining advancement now in research now that we're cutting back?
They're certainly hoping to. It's a little soon to say, but we have seen Europe quite explicitly try to recruit American scientists and say, if you come here, we will give you X dollars in grant money. We have seen scientists already move to Canada. Again, it's, how much of that there will be is unclear, but there's definitely an opportunity there that other countries are trying to seize.
Great. We'll be following your reporting. Thanks so much for your important reporting, Emily. Finally, we turn to Venice, where the secretive, star-studded wedding of Jeff Bezos and Zoran Sanchez has captured headlines around the world. Joining us from Italy is Emma Bubola, who's been covering the spectacle and brings us an inside look. Thanks for joining us, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
So, my main question, I haven't been able to find a definitive answer. How much did this wedding cost? Have you been able to shake that out?
Of course, we do not have an official number. Everything about this wedding has been kept very secret, and a lot of the providers have signed non-disclosure agreements, so it's very hard to have an exact number. The closest we got was from regional officials in Venice's Veneto region, who said that the number was around 40 million euros.
He's one of the richest people in the world, right? So that is a huge number for most normal people, but it might not be that huge of a number for Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, and I think this was, it became also a talking point because, of course, as you know, this wedding has created some controversy in Italy, and a lot of the people who were actually in favor of the wedding and very much welcomed Jeff Bezos' presence in Venice, which included business owners and city officials, they, mentioned again and again the fact that Jeff Bezos' wedding was injecting a lot of millions into Venice's economy. And, in addition to that, he was also donating to local charities and research centers. And so, they were pointing to that by saying, look, he's bringing us a lot of business, but on the other hand, the protesters and those who were against Bezos' wedding, they said that that's a very, very small number for someone who owns that, who has that amount of wealth.
Well, I'm wondering what you think the wedding reveals about the relationship between wealth, celebrity, and public sentiment in Europe right now.
Yeah, this was interesting because, as you saw, this wedding became much more than just a wedding in how it was received. So I had not covered Jeff Bezos much before, and I, didn't even follow Zoran Sanchez on Instagram. And but as I looked into this, I realized that in the past few years, Bezos had undergone this kind of significant makeover, and from this nerdy-looking guy, he had become this much more jacked up version of himself, often appearing without a shirt, and so it really looked like that him and Sanchez had started to create this kind of VIP, real VIP lifestyle for themselves, surrounding themselves with A-list celebrities, and so I think this wedding was kind of the culmination of this path. Leonardo DiCaprio came, Orlando Bloom came, a lot of people from Hollywood came, the Kardashians were there. And so, it just looked it just felt like they really wanted a Hollywood wedding, like the one that George and Amal Clooney had in Venice in 2014. But then it immediately appeared very clearly that this was not just a Hollywood wedding, by and large, definitely star-studded, over-the-top party, but also it became really caught up in a big political and moral conversation. And so I think, and a lot of the conversation did not end up being about like the bride or the clothes. I mean, there was significant conversation about that as well, but I think like especially in the leading up to it, the conversation was about like Jeff Bezos' morals and business dealings much more than about the wedding itself. And I think there are like two main reasons for that. One is like just like the tension boiling in Venice over its identity and what is perceived as a sellout of the city to just like the highest bidder, and it's becoming this kind of like background for photos slash amusement park. And on the other hand, it also, I think, speaks of like it shows a broader like frustration with what is perceived as an unchecked wealth accumulation and this widening gap between the ultra rich and ordinary citizens.
Yeah, I was surprised to see criticism of someone like Oprah Winfrey, who I also believe attended the wedding, that she was there. There were criticisms of certain celebrities that were there. Why would a celebrity like Oprah Winfrey be criticized for going to another billionaire's wedding?
I don't know about that. I actually had not seen criticism of Oprah going, but I think that, some of the guests, like for example, like Ivanka Trump also attended, um, and she was kind of like a live reminder of Bezos' presence at President Trump's inauguration and this kind of, cozying up to Trump in general. And I think that like that is President Trump's action are seeding panic in Europe, and so kind of Bezos also represented like a kind of proximity to Trump. I was like part of the grievance that many people expressed, but overall, I think like the guests just played into the lavishness and showiness of it all. A lot of them were influencers and like the Kardashians, and I think they strengthened this feeling of having Venice as like the backdrop for Instagram photos of the rich and not like instead of being a real city.
Yeah, so the event may have generated nearly $1 billion in value for Venice. I'm wondering if you think because of that potential economic impact, will we see future events like this in Venice?
I think so. It definitely exacerbated concerns about over-tourism in Venice. But on the other hand, city officials have been, very firm in defending the wedding. So I also think that like, over-tourism and Jeff Bezos' wedding are two very different things that like in the narrative, like they were very mixed up, but it's very different. So like what Venice's authorities are oppose are like, tens of thousands of day trippers who come to Venice every day. They sleep in like campings outside the city, and they come in with their sandwich. They don't buy anything in Venice, and they just, produce garbage. And so they have been very vocal, like Venice's authorities have been very vocal against this type of tourism. On the other hand, they always refer to quality tourism as something that they would want in opposition to these like massive day trippers. And by quality tourism, they often mean wealthy people. And so, Jeff Bezos is exactly the type of event that the officials think is going to bring prestige and business to the city. And so, of course, like as a reporter, I try not to predict the future, but what I can say, I think, is that town officials have not shown any repentance for hosting this wedding, and they've actually talked about the protesters as damaging the city's image, which I thought was interesting because it's kind of talking about a city as you would talk about a brand.
Thanks, Emma. We look forward to more of your reporting on this issue.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this edition of Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Jeff May, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Don't forget to download the CUNY TV app where you can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.